Every year, more than 7 million people visit the Hoover Dam. They stand on the observation deck, cameras in hand, calling it a triumph of American engineering. They marvel at the Art Deco towers, the curved concrete wall stretching 726 feet high, the power generators humming beneath their feet. Tour guides tell them about President Hoover, about the Colorado River tamed, about electricity reaching millions of homes across the Southwest. What they don't tell them is that they're standing on top of a mass grave, a cemetery with no headstones, no memorials, no names carved into the polished bronze plaques that tourists pass without a second glance. The official count says 96 workers lost their lives building this dam between 1931 and 1936. That number is carved into the visitor center walls. It's repeated in every tour script, printed in every brochure. But construction logs, hospital records from Las Vegas, and testimony from surviving workers tell a very different story. The real number is closer to 200, maybe more. And here's what makes it worse. Those 96 names on the memorial plaque? They're not even close to complete. Because if your death was classified as natural causes, if you were a subcontractor instead of a direct employee, if you happened to be Black or Mexican or Chinese, there was a very good chance your name never made it onto any official list at all. Let me tell you about Virgil, not his last name, because in the records of the 6 companies incorporated, the consortium that built this dam, he's listed simply as Virgil, drowned, Tunnel 4, December 20th, 1922. He was one of the first to perish here, working in the diversion tunnels that would redirect the Colorado River so construction could begin. The tunnels were 56 feet in diameter, blasted through solid rock with dynamite, and filled with a toxic mixture of carbon monoxide, silica dust, and gasoline fumes from the machinery. Virgil's job was to clear debris after each blast. On that December morning, a flash flood roared through Tunnel 4 without warning. The records say he drowned. What they don't say is that his remains were never recovered. The company decided it would take too long to drain the tunnel completely, so they sealed it and kept working. Virgil is still there, somewhere in the darkness beneath the dam, entombed in rock and water and concrete that would eventually be poured over everything. And here's the thing that should bother every single person who visits this place. Virgil wasn't an anomaly. He was the first entry in what would become a very long, very deliberately incomplete list. Because the 6 companies incorporated, led by a man named Frank Crow, who locals called Hurry Up Crow for his obsession with speed, had a system. A remarkably efficient system for making inconvenient deaths disappear from the official record. If a worker collapsed from heat stroke in 120-degree tunnels, the company doctor would write, "Heart attack, natural causes." If someone perished from carbon monoxide poisoning after 16-hour shifts in unventilated spaces, the death certificate would read, "Pneumonia, unrelated to employment." If your body fell 700 feet from a scaffold and couldn't be identified anymore, you became unknown worker, accidental death. And if any of those things happened, your family got nothing. No compensation, no acknowledgement, no name on any memorial. The Hoover Dam is called one of the 7 wonders of the industrial world. More than 4 million cubic yards of concrete, enough to pave a highway from San Francisco to New York. But nobody talks about what else is mixed into that concrete, or who. To understand what's really buried in this dam, you need to understand what it was like to work here. Black Canyon in the summer of 1931 was not just hot. It was a concrete oven heated to temperatures that would make the Sahara Desert feel temperate by comparison. Air temperatures regularly hit 119, 120, sometimes 123 degrees Fahrenheit. But inside the diversion tunnels, where men worked with no ventilation, no air circulation, just drilling and blasting and breathing in dust and fumes, the temperature could reach 140 degrees. Workers would collapse after 2 hours. Some didn't get back up. Harlan was 28 years old when he started working in Tunnel 3 in July of 1931. He'd come from Oklahoma with his wife and newborn daughter, one of thousands fleeing the Dust Bowl, desperate for any kind of work during the Depression. The job paid $4 a day, which was extraordinary money in 1931, enough to feed a family and maybe, just maybe, save enough to start over somewhere else. Harlan lasted 6 weeks. On August 14th, he collapsed during his shift. The company medic, a man named Dr. Lloyd Winters, who was employed directly by 6 companies incorporated, examined him briefly and declared the cause of death as pneumonia, acute respiratory failure. The death certificate was signed within 3 hours. Harlan's body was released to his wife the next day, with strict instructions that he needed to be buried immediately due to the heat. No autopsy, no investigation, no questions. But here's what Dr. Winters didn't write on that death certificate. Harlan died from carbon monoxide poisoning. The tunnels were filled with gas from the explosives, from the gasoline-powered machinery, from the vehicles moving supplies in and out. There was no ventilation system installed yet, because installing ventilation would slow down construction. And Frank Crowe had promised to complete the dam in 7 years instead of the projected 10. Every day mattered. Every hour counted. Workers complained about headaches, dizziness, nausea. They called it tunnel sickness or the canyon fever. Dr. Winters called it everything except what it actually was. Between July and December of 1931 alone, 42 men died of what the company listed as pneumonia, or heart failure, or natural causes. All of them had been working in the tunnels. All of them had complained of the same symptoms, and not a single death certificate mentioned carbon monoxide. Then there was Marvin, one of the high scalers, the men who dangled from ropes 700 feet above the canyon floor, using jackhammers to clear loose rock from the cliff faces before concrete could be poured. These men were paid $5.60 a day, the highest wage on the project, because everyone knew it was the most dangerous job on site. Marvin had been doing this work for 8 months, when his rope snapped on a Tuesday morning in March of 1932. He fell the entire height of the canyon wall. It took 3 days to recover his remains from the bottom of the gorge, because the company didn't want to stop concrete operations to retrieve him immediately. When they finally brought him up, the foreman reported the death as accidental fall, equipment failure. But the rope hadn't failed. It had been cut. Not deliberately, but through friction against the sharp volcanic rock, a problem that workers had been reporting for weeks. The company had done nothing about it, because replacing all the ropes would have cost money and time. Marvin was the 11th high scaler to perish that year. He wouldn't be the last. Eugene never made it onto any official list at all. He was working on the concrete pour, the massive operation where 8 cubic yard buckets of wet concrete were lowered by cable from the canyon rim down to the dam face. On June 9, 1933, something went wrong with the cable release mechanism. The bucket didn't stop where it was supposed to. It kept descending, and Eugene, who was guiding it into position, couldn't move fast enough. 16,000 pounds of concrete buried him instantly. The pour didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because once you start pouring concrete at that scale, stopping means the entire section has to be demolished and rebuilt. So they kept pouring. They poured right over Eugene. Later, the shift supervisor filed a report saying that Eugene had left the job site without notice, presumed to have quit. His wife, a woman named Lorraine, came to the site office 3 days later, asking where her husband was. They told her he'd abandoned his job. When she insisted on searching for him, they had security escort her off the property. She never received any death benefits. She never received any answers. And Eugene's name appears on exactly 0 official documents related to the Hoover Dam. Dr. Lloyd Winters signed death certificates for 96 workers during the construction of the Hoover Dam. But medical records that surfaced decades later show he examined and documented symptoms for over 140 men who lost their lives on this project. The difference between those two numbers tells you everything you need to know about how this dam was really built. That discrepancy, those 44 missing names, wasn't an accident. It was policy. Internal memos from 6 companies incorporated, discovered years later in a legal dispute over workers' compensation claims, reveal that the company had very specific instructions for handling deaths on site. If a worker perished from what the company called environmental factors, meaning heat, gas exposure, or working conditions, Dr. Winters was instructed to find an alternative medical explanation. The reasoning was brutally simple. Under Nevada state law in 1931, if a death was ruled as directly caused by workplace conditions, the company owed compensation to the family. But if the death was attributed to a pre-existing condition, or pneumonia, or heart failure, or any natural cause, the company owed nothing. Dr. Winters wasn't just a company physician. He was a gatekeeper whose job was to protect 6 companies incorporated from liability, and he was very, very good at his job. The workers knew what was happening. They saw men collapsing in the tunnels, coughing blood, unable to breathe. They watched co-workers stagger out into the sunlight, gasping for air, and never come back. They had a name for it among themselves, tunnel death, and everyone who worked in those diversion tunnels knew that breathing that air for too long would eventually end you. But speaking up meant losing your job, and during the Great Depression, losing your job meant your family starved. So most stayed quiet. But not everyone. Clayton was a shift supervisor in Tunnel 2, 34 years old, married with 2 sons. In November of 1931, after watching 3 men from his crew perish in a single week, all listed as pneumonia, he went to Frank Crowe himself with a formal complaint. He brought documentation, a list of symptoms, dates, names. He demanded that the company install proper ventilation systems immediately and halt tunnel operations until the air quality could be verified as safe. Frank Crowe listened to Clayton's presentation. Then he told him that if he didn't like how the company ran its operations, he was welcome to find employment elsewhere. Clayton was fired the next morning. 3 months later, in February of 1932, Clayton's body was found at the bottom of a construction access road, his truck overturned. The official report called it accidental death, lost control of vehicle. But several workers who had been on night shift that evening later told investigators that they'd seen 2 other vehicles near Clayton's truck just before the crash, both driving without headlights. No investigation was ever conducted. Clayton's widow received no compensation because his death occurred off-site and was ruled as unrelated to his employment. But the deaths inside the canyon, as devastating as they were, tell only part of this story. Because the workers didn't live at the dam site. They lived in a place called Ragtown, and Ragtown was its own kind of hell. It was a sprawling camp of canvas tents and wooden shacks about a mile from the construction site, built on flat desert ground with no shade, no running water, and no sewage system. By the summer of 1932, more than 5,000 people lived there. Workers, wives, children, all crammed into tents that turned into ovens when the sun came up. Temperatures inside those tents could reach 130 degrees by mid-afternoon. The nearest water source was a single hand-pumped well that served the entire camp, and by July, that well was producing water that tested positive for coliform bacteria. People got sick, children especially. Dysentery spread through Ragtown like wildfire that summer, and the company's response was to post signs warning workers that illness from poor sanitary habits was their own responsibility. Ruby was 6 years old, the daughter of a concrete worker named Dale, who had moved his family to Nevada from Arkansas in search of work. She developed a fever on July 18, 1932. Her mother tried everything: cold compresses, aspirin, prayer. But in that heat, in those conditions, with no access to clean water or medical care beyond the company clinic, which refused to treat family members of workers, there wasn't much anyone could do. Ruby passed away on July 21st. The local coroner, who was paid by the county but worked closely with 6 Companies Incorporated, listed her cause of death as dehydration and fever, natural causes. There was no investigation into the camp conditions, no questions asked about why a child living in America in the 20th century would perish from dehydration. Ruby's father buried her in a small cemetery outside Boulder City, a cemetery that doesn't exist anymore because the land was cleared for development in the 1960s. There's no marker, no record of where she rests, just like there's no official count of how many other children didn't survive Ragtown. By the time the Hoover Dam was completed in 1936, the pattern was unmistakable. Any death that could be blamed on something other than working conditions was reclassified. Any death that occurred off-site was ignored. Any death involving someone who wasn't a direct employee, subcontractors, family members, anyone who could be classified as unrelated to operations, simply vanished from the official record. And the system worked perfectly. 6 Companies Incorporated completed the dam 2 years ahead of schedule, under budget, and with what they claimed was an exemplary safety record. 96 names. That's what they wanted history to remember. Not the real number, not the truth. But even that 96, that official number carved into bronze and repeated in every history book, doesn't tell you who was actually counted. Because there was another layer to this system, one that went deeper than just reclassifying causes of death. It was about deciding who counted as a person worth documenting in the first place. Silas worked on the dam for 11 months. He was a black man from Louisiana, hired not by 6 Companies Incorporated directly, but by a subcontracting firm that supplied labor for the more dangerous, less desirable jobs that white workers could refuse. On September 7, 1933, Silas was working on scaffolding 80 feet above the canyon floor when a cable securing the platform snapped. He fell. Multiple workers witnessed it. But when you look at the official casualty reports from that week, Silas doesn't appear. Not under his name, not under unknown worker, not anywhere. The reasoning, according to internal company documents, was that subcontracted labor deaths were the responsibility of the subcontracting firm, not 6 Companies Incorporated. Silas's death was filed with the subcontractor, a small operation that went bankrupt 6 months later, taking all of its records with it. No memorial, no compensation, no acknowledgement that he was ever there. Francisco and Miguel were brothers from Chihuahua, Mexico. They'd crossed the border legally in 1931 with work permits, part of a wave of Mexican laborers recruited specifically for the Hoover Dam because they were willing to take jobs that others wouldn't and for wages that others wouldn't accept. They worked in the dynamite crews, The teams that drilled holes into solid rock, packed them with explosives, and blasted away tons of canyon wall to make room for the dam's foundation. On March 4, 1934, something went wrong with a detonation sequence. The blast went off early. Francisco and Miguel were both working within the blast radius. They didn't survive. But on the casualty report filed that day, they aren't listed as Francisco and Miguel. They're listed as Worker 1 and Worker 2, Explosion Incident, Tunnel 5. Their families back in Chihuahua were never notified. The company had no record of their legal names, no emergency contacts on file, nothing. They were paid in cash at the end of each week. Their names never formally entered into any payroll system that survived. When their bodies were prepared for burial, they were interred in a shared grave in a Boulder City cemetery under a marker that reads, Unknown Workers, March 1934. 2 brothers, 2 lives, reduced to a bureaucratic footnote. Here's where it gets even more disturbing. That memorial plaque at the Hoover Dam, the one that lists 96 names, was installed in 1935, before construction was even finished. The names were selected from official company records of workplace fatalities, but hospital admission records from Las Vegas between 1931 and 1936 tell a different story. St. Rose Dominican Hospital, the nearest medical facility to the dam site, logged 143 admissions of dam workers who did not survive their injuries or illnesses during that 5-year period. 143, not 96, and that's just one hospital. That doesn't include workers who passed away at the site and were never transported anywhere, or whose families couldn't afford medical care, or who were treated at company facilities and never made it into any civilian medical records. And here's the thing that should terrify you. This wasn't unique to the Hoover Dam. This was standard practice for major American infrastructure projects during this era. The Golden Gate Bridge, constructed between 1933 and 1937, officially lists 11 workers who perished during construction. But longshoremen's union records and injury reports from San Francisco hospitals suggest the real number was closer to 40. Grand Coulee Dam in Washington state, built between 1933 and 1942, official count is 77. But tribal records from the Colville and Spokane reservations, whose members made up a significant portion of the workforce, document at least 120 names of men who went to work on that dam and never came home. The Brooklyn Bridge in New York, the Transcontinental Railroad, the Interstate Highway System. Every single one of these projects, these monuments to American progress and ingenuity, was built on the backs of workers whose deaths were systematically undercounted, misclassified, or completely erased from history. It was a pattern, a deliberate, documented, nationwide pattern of making certain people disappear. Immigrants, people of color, the poor, anyone who could be classified as expendable, anyone whose death wouldn't generate uncomfortable questions or expensive lawsuits. They built America's infrastructure, and America thanked them by forgetting they ever existed. So what's left? What evidence remains of all these erased lives, these forgotten names? The answer is both simple and deeply unsettling. They're still there. All of them. The Hoover Dam contains 6.6 million tons of concrete. That concrete was poured in sections, massive blocks that interlocked to form the curved wall that holds back Lake Mead. And somewhere inside those blocks, entombed in that concrete, are the remains of workers who were never recovered. Virgil in Tunnel 4. Eugene buried under a concrete pour that couldn't be stopped. Others whose names we'll never know because their deaths were never documented, never investigated, never acknowledged, The dam isn't just a monument to American engineering. It's a tomb. An unmarked mass grave holding the bones of men who built something magnificent and paid for it with their lives, only to have history forget them entirely. In 2003, during routine maintenance work inside one of the dam's interior inspection tunnels, a crew made a discovery. They found remains. Human remains embedded in the concrete wall of a service corridor that had been sealed since 1934. The Bureau of Reclamation, the federal agency that manages the dam, immediately classified the finding as archaeological material and shut down that section of the facility. No public announcement was made. No investigation was opened. The area was resealed, and as far as official records show, nothing else was ever done about it. When reporters from the Las Vegas Review-Journal filed Freedom of Information Act requests for details about the discovery, they were told that all documentation related to the finding had been lost during an office relocation. That was the official response. Lost during an office relocation. The Bureau of Reclamation still maintains that 96 workers perished during the construction of the Hoover Dam. They have never revised that number. They have never acknowledged the hospital records, the witness testimonies, the internal company memos that proved the real count was much higher. When historians and journalists have pressed for an official recount or a formal investigation, the response has been consistent. Those documents, if they ever existed, are no longer available. That's the government's position. That's where the conversation ends. But there's someone who hasn't forgotten. Her name is Vivian. She's 94 years old now, and she lives in Boulder City, the town that was built to house dam workers and their families. Her husband was named Bert. He worked on the high-scaling crews, the ones who dangled from ropes clearing loose rock. In August of 1934, Bert's rope failed. He fell 680 feet. His body was never recovered from the bottom of the canyon because a concrete pour was scheduled for that section, and the company decided it was more efficient to proceed than to halt operations for a recovery effort. Vivian was 22 years old, pregnant with their first child. She received no death benefits, no compensation, no official acknowledgement from Six Companies Incorporated that her husband had even worked there, because Bert was classified as a subcontractor, and subcontractor deaths were not the company's responsibility. She spent 70 years, 7 decades, trying to get Bert's name added to that memorial plaque. The Bureau of Reclamation has denied every request. Their reason? Insufficient documentation of employment. 7 million people visit the Hoover Dam every year. They take photos in front of it. They call it a marvel, a testament to what America can accomplish when it puts its mind to something. They stand on observation decks and look down at the turquoise water of Lake Mead and feel awe at human achievement. And maybe they should feel awe. But they should also know what they're really looking at. This isn't just a dam, it's a grave, a cemetery with no names, no flowers, no prayers. Just concrete and water and silence. And the next time you see a photo of someone smiling in front of this American icon, remember something. They're standing on top of people, real people, with families, with dreams, with names that should be remembered but never will be. That's the real legacy of the Hoover Dam. Not the electricity it generates, not the water it provides, but the lives it took, and the system that made sure nobody would ever have to answer for it. How many other American icons are built on unmarked graves? How many monuments have we been taught to admire without ever asking who paid the real price? That's the question that should haunt you. Because the Hoover Dam isn't unique. It's just one of the few where we can still find the evidence if we're willing to look.